This is a really big book, and it is not an easy read, but it's a book that was recommended at the Emerge conference that I went to, gosh, almost 2 years ago, a year and a half ago. Mandy Fox was talking about this book, and so I picked it up, not realizing that it was going to be larger than the Bible. Actually, I don't think it is, but it feels like it. Anyways, I'm giving you the last paragraph of the book, okay? The book is called The Religion of Tomorrow by Ken Wilber. It's a vision for the future generations of the great traditions, more inclusive, more comprehensive, more complete. As we were talking about the evolution of religion, this was pointed to as a definitive piece of writing as we move forward. And this is how it ends. It is possible to remake this world because you, the very deepest you, are its one and only author, its sole creator. But you are not alone. Because the deepest self of this deepest you is looking out through the eyes of every sentient being alive, including all 9 billion humans on the planet. You can remake the world because you possess 18 billion hands, more than enough to reshape and refigure all that needs to be done. Feel the unimaginable creative power of this one and only I amness, and know that anything is possible. Grab the very best map you can possibly find and strike out in the direction of this radically new territory, knowing that the entire creative force of the whole cosmos is your constant companion. Grab yourself, find the world, reawaken and remake both. This is now your own deepest moral imperative. By whatever lights you can find, shine on the world, radiate the world, illuminate the world, enlighten the world.
Today's reading comes from the book of Ruth. One day, Naomi said to Ruth, "My daughter, it is my duty to ensure your security and fulfillment, and make sure you are provided for. And Boaz, whose workers you have been following, is your closest relative. Tonight he'll be winnowing grain on the threshing floor. Wash up and put on perfume and dress in your finest clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor. But don't let him know you're there until he has finished eating and drinking. When he goes to sleep, watch to see where he lies down. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down with him. He'll tell you what to do next." Ruth replied, "I will do as you tell me." So she went down to the threshing floor, just as her mother-in-law told her to do.
Would you pray with me? Ancient One, as we talk about the stories that we tell in our world and our religion, be with us, shining light where there has been darkness, guiding us in a way forward, evolving to greater understanding and growth and wisdom. May the words of our mouth, the meditations of each of our hearts, be filled with your light and your insight. Amen. So here's the bottom line for today. Our stories must change if we want to change the world. Our stories that we tell ourselves and our children about who we are and about who God is have to change in order for us to grow and evolve, because it's those stories that make up the very foundation of how we see ourselves, how we live, and how we function and behave in the world. Our stories affect how we live spiritually, how we feel emotionally. Our stories affect us intellectually and societally. And unless there is evolution there, there will not be evolution of ourselves and of our world. Think about some of the stories we tell about different kinds of people. Let's take just a really recent one. Remember when the AIDS crisis happened in like the 80s? And the stories that we told about people who had that dreadful illness, the way we treated them like lepers and shunned them, and how that story, as people have become educated around the illness, has changed in the last 30, 35 years. What other stories about what other people or other practices need to change for us to evolve? Name one. The immigrants, the stories about the immigrants. Is that what you were going to say, Connie? What other stories? Muslims. Anybody who's got darker skin and seems like they're from, that area of the world, whether it's the Indians that we worshipped with last night, or it's the Muslims, or it's the Sikhs. Black people. Racism. Prisoners. The elderly, what they can do, what they can't do. Our children done.
People with disabilities.
People with disabilities or differently abled people. And how about, what was it?
Global warming.
Global warming. Sure, the stories we tell ourselves, our world about the state of our earth.
Our LGBTQ community.
Our LGBTQ community. And we've seen that story evolving somewhat, but it's got a long way to go. Nobody's named women, but that's the story that Ruth tells. If we take Ruth as a one example of a story that has evolved but needs to continue to evolve, we see that she offers us an opportunity to look at how that works and how our stories affect us. And we understand these stories are not simply social stories, but they're social religious stories. Because we cannot separate the spiritual from the social and the ways that they've affected one another. So I want to use her story as a microcosm, as an example of what it means to have a story evolve and how that changes the world we live in and the way that we look at our very selves and connect to the divine. So if we go back 7,000 years, we go back to when the goddess religions were the primary religions in huge ancient civilizations. And we see that in those civilizations where the goddess was revered and worshipped, that women had a very different role. Women owned property. Women ran businesses. Women lent money. Men and women were much more equal. Men helped take care of the kids. Sexuality and fertility were revered and were recognized as a gift of the goddess. And violence against women wasn't tolerated. In Sumer, if a man raped a woman, he was put to death. Those societies were primarily peaceful, agricultural societies. You had some where there were warriors, and then women were able to be warriors. Priests and priestesses existed in the temples. And they were advanced civilizations that had economies, that developed languages, that had written skills. So what happened to the goddess religions? They were wiped out. Slowly but surely, invaders came from the north, from the area that we might know of as Denmark and the area above the Baltic Sea. And these northern invaders came and they changed the stories about the goddesses, and they changed as well the stories about the women. And so what happened was these aggressive warrior invaders came in with their male sky god who lived at the top of the mountain with lightning and thunder. And that sky god, well, go figure, either killed the goddesses or took them as their wives or their consorts. And so these great mother goddesses, these creatress goddesses, were now submissive, if existent at all. And so we have this amazingly powerful female figure who's been demoted or destroyed. And at the same time, we see that the priestesses who body, mind, and spirit served the goddess have now been demoted, not even demoted, but they've been degraded, that's not a word, degraded, denigrated, thank you, somebody find me a word. I'd like to buy a vowel. Denigrated and turned into temple priestesses. And we're looked down on. The symbols that were used for the goddess, their stories were changed. So the snake and the owl were wonderful symbols of divine feminine wisdom. And we all know what happened to the snake in the Adam and Eve story. And how that story was changed. The owl, the screech owl, was turned into the symbol for Lilith. Do you remember Lilith? Lilith was Adam's first wife that we don't ever talk about because she wouldn't submit to Adam. But her symbol is the screech owl. She was kicked out of Eden before Eve came along. So the stories change. And as the stories about the goddess change, as the religious, spiritual stories change, women's roles changed. All we have to do is look to the Old Testament to see what women's roles turned into, where women were possessions of men. Women could be divorced and given nothing, but they had no power to divorce. Fathers could sell their daughters. If women lost their virginity before they were married, they could be stoned. If women were raped, they either had to marry their rapist, or if they were betrothed or married, then they were stoned. The women were stoned. Women had to call their husbands master or lord. That's the culture that the story of Ruth takes place in. So we started our story of Ruth last week with a wonderful story of Ruth and Naomi and their bond and their friendship, which is a great story. Most preachers don't read the next lectionary reading, which is the story that we read today, because it's an awful story. It's the story of how those two women, in a very difficult situation of having no power, no man to look after them, would have ended up on the streets homeless and begging if they didn't do something. And so Naomi takes her daughter-in-law aside one day and she says, all right, Ruth, this is what we're going to do. My husband had kind of a remote relative. His name is Boaz. He's a nice guy. I think we can get him to take care of us. But this is how we're going to ensure that we're going to do that. So I want you to take a bath, put on some good perfume, put on your best dress, and he's going to be on the threshing floor tonight. And they'll be drinking. It's in the next couple of sentences. You're going to have to go home and debrief your children. I'm sorry. Maybe not Nolan, but... So actually it says in the next couple of lines that Boaz gets a little bit tipsy. And so they're expecting this. And Naomi says to Ruth, I want you to go, and after he's had a few drinks and he's laid down and gone to sleep, I want you to go in and lay next to him and uncover his feet, which is a Hebrew euphemism for genitals. Oh yeah, that puts a whole new spin on the story, doesn't it? I I thought about calling this Sacred Journeys After Dark. Maybe X-rated Bible stories for the morning. And as Brian said, Boaz will know what to do at that point, right? The only good news here is that Boaz was, an upstanding guy and made an honest woman out of Ruth afterwards. He agrees to marry her, he agrees to take on her mother-in-law, and he protects them and he cares for them, and they have a child, and the child is named Obed and becomes the great-grandfather of King David, which is probably the real point of the story for them back then. But this is not a bedtime story for our children. There is no way to preach this story from a good moral perspective. The only thing I can say is that Ruth did what she had to do for them to survive in that day and age. But she should not have had to do it. She was in a culture that was male-dominated, where the religion was male-dominated, where it was a male-imaged God, and she had no power. Women were powerless second-class citizens. And really have been, and still are, to some extent. The goddess religions were entirely wiped out by the year 500. And even the equality that Jesus preached, and that early Christian communities had, was gone within a couple generations. So fast forward to the 1800s and the Enlightenment, when we suddenly have all kinds of scientific discoveries, including Darwin. And the story is getting fractured a little bit. Boy, if there was evolution and, the 6 days of the creation story isn't hardcore, literal truth, well then maybe the church isn't right about everything. Maybe the Bible isn't right about everything. And what do we do with that? So as the story cracks, women see an opportunity. And with a lot of fighting and a lot of violence and a lot of struggle, women find a way to get the vote by 1920. If it's a man, tell him he's in trouble. So the crack in the story allows women enough leeway to get the vote. But one of the leaders of that movement, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, swore off organized religion because she understood that the Bible and organized religion was part of what was holding women down. Because she said, she grew up Presbyterian, but she didn't want anything to do with it. She said, the story the Bible tells is that women brought sin and death into the world. And that a woman was the cause of the fall of all of humanity. Go back to the Adam and Eve story. The Bible says that marriage is bondage for a woman, and that childbirth is supposed to be suffering and pain, and that women are supposed to be their husband's helpmates and are supposed to be dependent on him. The Bible says that if a woman has a question about religion or God, they should go ask their husband at home. Geez, can't imagine why she took issue with all that. So there was a crack in the story. And if we move a little further on, we get to the 1950s, post-World War II, and Rosie the Riveter, and there's another crack in the story. Because these women are needed to go into the workforce. And women are given a little bit of authority and sense of accomplishment as they're doing the same jobs that men are doing. And you can't put the squeeze cheese back in the can. So after they got to be Rosie the Riveter, the men didn't get to come home and go, oh, now you can go back at home and be barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen and make my dinner and be dressed nice and have makeup on at 5 o'clock in the morning when I need to leave for work. Didn't get to happen. 1960s, we have Vatican II. And there's a lot that doesn't change in the Catholic Church, but one little piece about women changed, and that was that women could now be up on the chancel area. Women could be readers. The crack in the story, a shift in the story. Then we get to the 1970s and the Equal Rights Amendment and the Equal Rights Movement. Do you know that I learned something this week that I did not know? And maybe I'm the only stupid one out there, but did you know that the Equal Rights Amendment is not actually part of our Constitution? Good. See, some of you are smarter than I am. It was passed by the Senate and Congress in 1972, but it had to be ratified by 38 states. It was only ratified by 35 within the time frame they were given, and so it is not, to this day, part of our Constitution. In the last 2 years, Nevada and Illinois have ratified, but we're one short. So part of our stories are our songs and our movies. 1972, Helen Reddy came out with, do you remember? I Am Woman, Hear Me Roar. In numbers too big to ignore. Do you remember the rest of the lines? Yeah, I lost it. Because they're good words. I almost tried to ask the band to sing this with me, but I wasn't sure I could do it. And I know too much to go back and pretend, because I've heard it all before. I've been down there on the floor, and no one's ever going to keep me down again. I am strong. I am invincible. I am a woman. And you know, her husband was her manager at the time. They took that song to her record company, Capitol Records, and her producer said, "You have got to make her stop doing that women's lib crap. It's going to be the end of her. Why do you let her do this?" He said, "That song is a bunch of S, asterisk, asterisk, asterisk." And her husband got up on the desk of the producer and did something that I probably should not share. And took that song to different markets. Started with the DC market, and they started playing that song, and women called in and requested that song over and over and over again. And so market by grueling market, they took it across the United States, and then it was a #1 hit by the end of 1972. And she was nominated for a Grammy Award for that, won the Grammy Award, and in her speech, at the end, or when she was given the award, she thanked her husband for making her a success. And then she thanked God, because she makes all things possible. Because she knew that the story societally that she was trying to change was also a spiritual story that is evolving. And you can't have one without the other. Think about our movies. I know this is a really long sermon, but I'm really into this, so stick with me, okay? Think about our movies. What did Disney put out in the 30s, 40s, and 50s? Snow White. Snow White. Sleeping Beauty. And Cinderella. Yes. Yes. And what TV sitcoms were there in the 50s, 60s?
Father Knows Best.
Father Knows Best. I Love Lucy. Dick Van Dyke. Leave It to Beaver. I Will Never Be June. No pearls. No, sorry, honey, ain't gonna happen. Yeah, the ways they picture women. Okay, so now in the last dozen years, what did Disney put out? Frozen and Brave, Lion King, Wonder Woman. What female heroines do we see in the movies these days? Aside from Wonder Woman.
Superheroes.
Think about the strong superheroes. Think about Hermione Granger and Harry Potter. About the Hunger Games. Katniss, Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. Look at how the stories have shifted. And I don't think it's a coincidence that as those stories have shifted from Snow White to now, did anybody see Mirror, Mirror with Julia Roberts?
Yes.
It's the 2012 reinvention of Snow White, where Snow White ends up with the dwarves and they teach her how to fight. And she has to save the prince. Go rent it. Julia Roberts is the evil queen. But that's the shift in the story. That's saying women don't have to be, oh, I have to be saved by the prince. Oh, the heck with that, I'm gonna go save the prince. Teach me how to fight. It's a shift in the story. And at the same time all of that happened, women were being ordained. 1950s is when the women started being ordained. And that started to shift, and now, aside from, in the Catholic Church and the Southern Baptist Church and some of the really fundamentalist churches that still won't allow women to ordain, women are half the numbers in seminaries. I also don't think it's a coincidence that church attendance is slacking off. Because as people drift away from the churches where the stories are, the stories church is telling don't make sense anymore. And so as women get a little more power and authority, the church is sort of not keeping up. I believe that we are in a huge shift spiritually and societally. But it kind of looks like your house does when it's under construction. Have you done a major construction project? You tear everything out, there's tools everywhere, and dust everywhere, and a mess everywhere, and you can't vision what it's going to look like when you're in the middle of it. It just looks like a mess. That's where we're at. Someday maybe we'll get it all put back together in a nice new form. But until then, it's uncomfortable and unfun, and we just have to keep pushing forward and trying to do the best things we can do. I believe that what each of us needs to do is to help the story shift. And it's got to shift inside in order for us to help it shift outside. And I believe that the way that we need to start doing that spiritually is to think about how we speak and think about the divine. So I think what Helen Wright did 46 years ago was what needs to start happening. Until we understand God in a different way, women's stories will not completely change. God has got to get out of the sky, and God has got to stop being exclusively male. I am asking, perhaps even pleading with you, to be conscious of the language you use when you speak of God, inside to yourself and to your children and to your grandchildren. If God is only male, it served to keep women subjugated for thousands of years. It's time for that to change. And I'm not even saying that God is female. God is neither. But if you're going to use male language, then at least use feminine language for the divine half the time. Try it with your friends. It's interesting to see what they do. And if you're not comfortable using any of those pronouns, then just use non-gendered language for God. Say spirit, divine essence, ground of our being. Start to change the story some more so that the next generation does not just see God as male and no place for women. And it's important for our young men as it is for our young women. Okay, so that was my challenge for the morning, because it's going to bring us back to Ken Wilber and what he said, which is that we're all one. Our deepest, deepest self is the divine that sees out through, what do you say, billion sentient beings' eyes. If we could start to see that, if we could start to see the divine everywhere, get God out of the clouds for Pete's sake, and see God everywhere, even in the people that you have a hard time with. God is not just in white people. God is not just in Packers fans. God is not just in Democrats or Republicans. God is not just in Christians. God is everywhere, in everyone. So those are your two challenges. Thank you for listening to me this morning.